Morning, church. What's left of it? Oklahoma? Really? Well, good, I guess, and bad for us. It gets weird south of Edgemont, just so you know. So, we sure enjoyed you being a part of our fellowship. Caleb read Mark chapter 4 a few minutes ago. It's one of the passages of Scripture that modern folks would really like to remove from the biblical narrative because, well, after all, it's just a legend that's grown, and we don't really know much about Jesus at this point because of these oral traditions that just were passed down from generation to generation. So that's basically what the world is saying about our faith. Obviously, people don't speak to storms and cause them to subside. So there's this constant barrage against our faith that goes on a regular basis, and you hear it. It's subliminal sometimes, but it is just always there. When modern media or the news outlets talk about Christianity, there was always this kind of wink thing going on that, these poor people think that there was this guy who could control storms and walk on water. I am a thinking, reasoning child of the scientific and industrial age, and I believe that this story is true. Amen. I know that doesn't endear me to some, but the truth of the matter is I don't really care too much. 120 years ago or so, the scholastic folks, the intellects of our age began to say that, and kind of confidently assert that the Gospels were written 100, 200 years after Jesus, after the events that they supposed to discuss, and there was this new idea that kind of surfaced that they were oral traditions that evolved over time, and that they were edited by the church. And this was the key deal, that the church edited all of this to push their agenda and to enforce church policies. So they actually put words in Jesus' mouth. He didn't really say a lot of the things that he said. In fact, truth of the matter is, we don't even know what Jesus said, because the church basically rose up and kind of wrote this down 100 years or so after the events. And so the legend of Jesus, they would say, has grown to what we have today. It doesn't help that our culture has attached the Easter Bunny and an elf and a flying sleigh to the story. The fact of the matter is that in the late 1960s, a begrudging admission by these scholars that the Gospels were actually written only about 40 years after the events that they proposed to talk about began to surface. And today, most scholars don't have a problem saying that all of the events, or all of the Gospels were completed within a 40-year period of time after Jesus walked. And why is that important? Well, it's important for several reasons, but one reason is that it becomes rather difficult to create a legend in 40 years. If it's an eyewitness account, it's very difficult to create something significantly different than those events that actually happened, because if there are eyewitnesses that are hanging around and you start telling a story that doesn't coincide with what the eyewitnesses saw, then they speak up and say what? Well, what are you talking about? That didn't really happen. Any of you who are parents have been in the situation where your kid comes home and you say, "Where you been?" and they start, or "Why are you home late?" Am I the only one who ever struggled with that? And then the story starts forming. You guys know what I'm talking about, where they say, "Well, we were driving along and the tire went flat," and as a parent, you have a couple of things that are going for you. One is that you tried all of those things when you were a kid, so you kind of know what the process is for creating an alibi, and kids haven't figured out that we're not as dumb as we look, and we actually probably pulled that same thing. But there are telltale indicators in a kid's fabricated story that parents begin to pick up on. And one of them is the absence of detail. Because any kid who's gotten very good at spinning a lie knows that if you add too much detail to the story, what's going to happen? Yeah, you're going to get busted because, mom and dad, start picking up on those things. So what I wanted to do with Mark chapter 4 today, this is really not, I don't think, what Mark intended necessarily out of Mark chapter 4. So we'll talk about, the real intent behind Mark 4 and the event on the lake as Jesus calms the storm. But next week, Lord willing. But what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about eyewitness accounts and how they work, and why I believe that what we're reading in Mark chapter 4 is not a fabrication, but it is, in fact, an eyewitness account of what took place. And I wanted to share some pictures with you before we get into this. And this was my favorite. So this very Anglo, kind of Barry Gibb look-alike guy is surfing on the bow of the ship, and he's got his hand extended in a very dramatic way. And I know that the artist intended for this to be somewhat symbolic, but I mean, I see all of these different ethnicities in the boat, and I get what he's saying. My point here is that when we take a story out of the Bible, we have a tendency to add a lot to it. Jesus was not an Anglo. Jesus was a Jew, and it's very likely he didn't look at all like Barry Gibb. And those of you who don't know who Barry Gibb is, that's okay. Google it and you'll see he looks about just almost like that guy. But this is not what happened. And I've got two more pictures I wanted to share with you for just a second. Here's another one, and this is a little bit more realistic, though. The boat that they're in is probably not anywhere near the size of the boat that they were in when this event took place. But again, you've got a picture of a very Anglo-Saxon Jesus standing there with his hand up in the air. And why that's necessary, I don't really know. So, and then this last one is another one pretty much like that one. This guy is even blonde or redheaded, which I think is intriguing. But again, he's got the... So I'm asking you why this? Why is this important to the story that these artists are telling? Why is that? Now that's not in the original text. Why is it added that there's this, hand extended out over the ocean? So let's read this again. Caleb did a great job of reading this, but I just want to read it again now that we've kind of got what we're going to be looking at. He says, that day when evening came, verse 35, Mark chapter 4, he said to the disciples, let's go over to the other side of the lake, Sea of Galilee. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern. Where's the stern? The back of the boat, yeah. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. That's not redundant. There's two things that happened. The wind stopped blowing and the water got calm. So he's talking about two separate things that happen. Anybody who's ever been in a boat in a storm knows that even after the wind stops blowing, the waves don't get calm. I mean, not for a while. So there's obviously something significant going on here. The wind, Jesus says, "Quiet, be still." And the wind dies down and the waves stop waving. He was completely calm. And the disciples, he said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him?" Notice that when Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves, it is very much like he is talking to an unruly child. Mark doesn't say, and he pulled out a wand and extended it over the bow of the boat. He doesn't say that he stretched out his hand. There's no theatrics here. And this is so beautiful to me. And so very much a part of eyewitness account. There's no embellishment to this. But by the way, I've never tried it, but I suspect it wouldn't really matter. If you've got an unruly child that's screaming and yelling, it probably doesn't help to extend your hand over the child when you say, "Be quiet, be still," But there's this very parental tone in what Jesus is doing as he just looks at there's no theatrics, no wand, no hand extended. He just says, "Shh, be quiet." And the winds and the waves obey him. I know I've already got most of what's on that slide done, but down close to the bottom, there's no show, no incantation, no wand. But I want you to look at the unnecessary detail in this story. So, if Mark were in the process of fabricating this, there are several things. For instance, I know this isn't proof positive, but it's one of those things that I put my faith on. The fact that there were other boats with him. That has no point whatsoever in the story. It has absolutely it has no bearing on the outcome of the story. It just says that there were other boats with them. Now, why would Mark put that in there? And the reason that Mark put it in there, and in fact, I actually have heard preachers preach sermons. I'm not making this up. There were other ships with him. And there was a preacher several years ago that preached a sermon on there were other ships with him. And there was fellowship, there was discipleship, there was... Okay? You remember the Gong Show? Those of you who don't remember the Gong Show, that's okay too. But I mean, that guy needed to be gonged. You know, that is not what's going on here. There's not a whole bunch of fellowship and discipleship ships with Jesus. There were... Why would he put that in there? Let me tell you why he put it in there. He put it in there because he was there that day, and there were other ships with them. Okay? It's unnecessary detail that is added because that's what Mark remembered about the day. There's another unnecessary detail here. What is it? Jesus was asleep in the stern, what? On a cushion. Say, well, what's the point behind the cushion? The point behind the cushion is Mark, just as a good eyewitness of the event, Mark remembered Jesus was sleeping on a cushion. It's not symbolic of anything. It's just a part of Mark's eyewitness testimony to what took place. So, there is the absence of embellishment, which typically you have in an eyewitness account, and there is also the presence of unnecessary detail. It's not symbolic of anything, it just is what Mark remembered about that event. So I want to talk about just a few of the reasons why we, and I know these aren't ironclad, I know they're not airtight. I want to talk about the airtight thing at the very end. But these are reasons why we believe that, let me rephrase, these are reasons why I believe that what we have in the New Testament, in the Gospels specifically, are real eyewitness accounts that are without embellishment or the addition of legend. This is just simply what it claims to be. It's an eyewitness account. There was a fella, and I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. Some people call him Papias, and some people call him Papias. I don't really care. He was an elder in the church, in the early Christian church. And he wrote, and we have his writings. They're not gospel. I know they're not. They're not inspired. I recognize that they're not inspired. But we have, to this day, you can go to a library and check out any number of books that have the writings of Papias. You can check out his writings. And so I don't put an awful lot of faith in this guy, other than the fact that he wrote that when he was a young man in 80 AD, there were 3 significant generations still alive when he was a young man. And he names these 3 generations. There were the eyewitnesses. And he talks about the fact that when he would go to church assembly, these eyewitnesses on occasion would be there. And they would tell the story about what they experienced when Jesus interacted with them, and etc. So there were the eyewitnesses, and then there were the elders who sat at the feet of the eyewitnesses, and then there were the 3rd generation, there were the disciples of the elders. Now, the reason that that's important is because you guys know who that guy is there? Most everybody knows who Richard Nixon is. You guys realize that about 40 years ago, right now, Richard Nixon got in a little trouble because he, what? You guys remember? He and his cronies bugged the headquarters of the Democratic National Convention in the name of those The office complex was Watergate. Now, the only reason I bring that up is because if I were to write a book about the fact that President Nixon was finally exonerated and that he wasn't guilty of doing that, what would be the problem with me writing that book? Well, it wasn't true. That would be problem number one. Problem number two is that there are people, lots of people, still alive today who lived through that and would debunk my book. They would say, well, we were there. I guarantee you he wasn't exonerated. In fact, he finally had to resign in shame as a result of what he did. This isn't a political thing. This is just a thing. My point is that 40 years in history is really not that long a period of time, and there are still a lot of people alive who remember, who were eyewitnesses back in that period of time. So, if the Gospels were, as we now are relatively certain, written 40 years or so after the events that they propose to discuss, you won't be able to say things like, well, Jesus calmed the storm if there are folks that were alive then who knew that wasn't the case. Acts chapter 26, and I'm just going to point to that. You guys can do your own reading in Acts 26. It's an amazing piece of scripture where Paul is defending himself before King Agrippa and other noteworthy people. But at one point, Paul makes this statement, and I love this statement. He says, King, you know that what I'm talking about didn't happen in a corner. Now, what's his point? His point is, you can check any of this out that you want to check out. In fact, you know that what I'm talking about is true, the things that I'm saying. Number two, why are there 4 Gospels and not just one? Did you guys ever think about that? When you include a second Gospel, what is the obvious problem if you're fabricating this? The two eyewitnesses don't match up. Okay, why is there 4? And the important thing is this: that the gospel, and I've mentioned this many times, that the Bible in general, the New Testament specifically, is written with the skeptic in mind, and it says, if you don't believe this, you check this out. We will give you what you need to do your own research and prove that this is true. And one of the things that I find absolutely powerful about the Gospels is that God sees fit to include not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 different Gospels, so that you've got 4 different vantage points. And they are very, very specifically 4 very different vantage points. And in fact, you can go on the web and just Google contradictions in the Gospels, and there's lots of them there. Now, I don't believe that there are really contradictions. I think that it's 4 different people looking at the same events from different angles, and so there are people who can say, well, that looks like a contradiction. But if you look at it more deeply, it really isn't a contradiction. The point is that God makes sure that there are 4 different eyewitness testimonies about the events surrounding the life of Jesus. Luke, that should be a subpoint, by the way, instead of another point. But Luke is one who says, I did the research. I checked all this stuff out. Luke is a very meticulous eyewitness. And talked to, I think, other eyewitnesses before he wrote his gospel. I'm just going to touch on this. I don't have time to really develop it, but I love this one. Have you ever noticed the names in the Gospels? Because one Gospel writer will mention a person's name, and another Gospel writer won't put that name in there. Have you guys ever noticed that? Am I the only one? Are you guys with me? Kind of all. I can tell when the eyeballs start rolling back in the heads. It's probably about time. But real quickly, do you guys remember the name of the blind guy that Jesus healed? Bartimaeus. Okay. Well, he's only mentioned in one gospel. I mean, the story is mentioned in multiple gospels, but his name is only mentioned once. Why do you suppose one gospel writer calls him by name and the other gospel writers didn't call him by name? The fact of the matter is, this is very powerful proof that this is eyewitness testimony. In some cases, an eyewitness, oh, I remember that guy's name. In another case, that person's name didn't come to mind, so the gospel writer didn't put it down. What was the name of the guy whose ear Peter cut off? Malchus. That's right. Only mentioned by name in one gospel. There were two fellas on the road. I love this one too. In Luke chapter 24, there were two disciples of Jesus on the road to Emmaus, and they're walking along talking about the events right after the crucifixion of Jesus. And Jesus joins them. You guys remember this? And they don't recognize him. And so they're having this conversation. And at some point in this whole thing, Jesus does reveal himself to them. It says, you know, he lets them experience his physical body. And there's only one of these guys that has a name. There are two disciples, but only one of them, a guy by the name of Cleopas. In Luke chapter 24. And Luke was a meticulous researcher. So the fact that typically if you're going to make the story up, you either name both of them or you don't name any of them. But this is very realistic to eyewitness testimony, where Luke says one of them's name was Cleopas. In Mark, Jesus is on the way to Golgotha. You guys remember? They grab Simon of Cyrene and they say, "You have to carry his cross." In the Gospel of Mark includes this footnote. He says, "Simon of Cyrene, the father of Rufus and Alexander." We don't have a clue who Rufus and Alexander is. They don't show up anywhere else in any of the gospel narratives. So why would Mark include the father of Rufus and Alexander in this particular story? The reason is because Rufus and Alexander were people that were well known to the folks to whom Mark was writing. And he says, if you don't believe this, what? You go ask Rufus and Alexander, because their dad carried the cross. Eyewitness testimony. We've already talked about the unnecessary detail. It's all over the place in the Bible, in the gospel narrative. Probably my favorite is John chapter 21, verse 12. You guys remember this was after Jesus was resurrected, and he's on the seashore, and the disciples are in the boat fishing. You guys remember? And so Jesus is standing on the seashore, and they're out there a little ways off the seashore fishing, and they're not having any luck. And this is typical of especially any boat that Peter's in. The guy never caught a fish without the help of the Lord, at least in what we have recorded. I mean, not once. Every time the guy went out, he didn't catch anything until Jesus, stepped in and intervened. I love that. So he's fishing, and Jesus is on the seashore, and he says, and I love this. So they don't know who it is. They don't recognize him. They're far enough off the coast there that they can't see exactly who it is. But Jesus says, "Hey, do you have any fish?" And they say, "No, fishing all night. The biggest bite we got was a mosquito." It doesn't actually say that. But Jesus says, "Throw the net on the other side." To which a bunch of rough old fishermen would have probably said, "Somebody throw a net on that guy." But they did. They threw the net on the other side of the boat, and it said they caught so many fish that they had a difficult time pulling the net into the boat. And then, John says, there were 153 fish. Not around 150, there were 153 fish. Why would John put that in there? He put it in there not because it was symbolic of anything. He put it in there because when they got it to the shore and they started counting how many fish, there were 153 fish in there. There's an eyewitness account. And that's the way eyewitness accounts work. I won't belabor this, but I do want to just say, many years ago, before I got married, some friends of mine, one friend of mine and my brother and I went to the Red River and were fishing and camping on the Red River between Oklahoma, by the way, and Texas. So Oklahoma is actually just kind of a North Texas. That's a joke that may get me in trouble. But we were fishing on the Red River between Oklahoma and Texas, and we got into literally a brood of vipers. We got into a big nest of water moccasins. And if you call Kim Allen Long up on the phone right now and ask him about that event, or you call my brother and ask him about that event, I suspect that they will tell you that we killed 12 water moccasins that night. Not 10, not about 5, we killed 12 water moccasins on a sandbar in the middle of the Red River. You know why I remember that number 12? Because it was 12 cottonmouths. Okay? So I'm not making that up. There's no fabrication there. It's a piece of a story that I remember. And there were 2 other eyewitnesses that'll say the very same thing. There were 153 fish. I love the picture of Jesus bent down, woman caught in adultery. Everybody's saying, what are we going to do? Are we going to stone her? What do you think? And Jesus says, absolutely nothing. It just says that he bent down and he wrote in the dirt. And I have read so many commentaries where they tried to, figure out what Jesus wrote in the dirt. You know what Jesus wrote in the dirt? Because if you do, enlighten me. Nobody knows what Jesus wrote in the dirt. Why did John say that? John said it because it was a non-essential brushstroke in an eyewitness account of an event that changed a guy's life. Actually changed probably several people's lives. Another reason that I am absolutely convinced this is eyewitness testimony is that so many of the truths are really inconvenient. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to say that if the church really did fabricate all of this, it would have been absolutely ridiculous for them to include some of the things that they include about Peter, including him calling down curses and swearing that he doesn't know Jesus. Anybody ever asked the question who he was calling curses down on? I suspect he was calling down curses on Jesus, because he was trying to make sure that nobody mixed him up with the disciples of Jesus. How in the world would that have even come to light if Peter didn't share it? There's all sorts of those inconvenient truths about the leaders of the church that would just not have been there if it weren't real eyewitness testimony. And lastly, and I'm out of time, so we'll just do this quick, but the most important thing is the compelling personality of Jesus himself. I said that this isn't airtight, and I know it's not. But you combine this with the personality and character of Jesus, I don't think God intended to give us an airtight argument. I think He intended to give us an airtight person, an airtight personality. So you take a look at His claims to be God, the kind of person that He was, the constant things like, peace be still to the water. No incantation, no God says peace be still. He just commands the winds and the waves. The fact that He's running around forgiving people of sin. You know, if Tom punches Ralph in the nose, and I say to Tom, your sin is forgiven, Ralph's going to have a problem with that, because the sin wasn't against me, it was against Ralph. But Jesus says to a guy, your sins are forgiven. What does that imply? That the sin, all sin, is against him. And He doesn't make a big deal out of it. He doesn't say, I'm God, so I forgive sin. He just says your sins are forgiven. But the implication is He's claiming to be something a whole lot more than just a good guy. So, I'm going to end right there. Tim, come lead us an invitation song.